Hey there, in today's video I wanted to take a moment to reflect, and I'd like to share some of the thoughts that have been percolating over the last few weeks, especially as I look back on what's happened over the past 11 years or so, and more specifically how I now see the legal profession. So here's the context. I was still in medical practice when I decided to study law. I started my LLB in 2010 and finished it in 4 years. At the time, I had no intention of becoming a practicing attorney, none. I studied law out of interest, out of curiosity. But as my story escalated, as things reached a kind of a climax, I realized maybe it was worth actually qualifying. So I did my articles in 2014, and back then I really believed that law was fascinating. And to be fair, the book knowledge is. The theory of law makes it sound noble. You're taught that the law is fair, and if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear. The truth will ultimately come out, that both sides will be heard, that the magistrate or judge or chairperson on a committee will weigh the evidence and decide based on the merits, and that justice will prevail. Well, that's the theory. But my experience with the Health Professions Council, which wrapped up about 4, maybe 5 years ago, taught me something very different. What I went through was a gross miscarriage of justice. It dragged on for 6 years, and looking back, what I've come to see, quite painfully, is this. The theory and the practice of law are completely different beasts, because in law school, no one tells you what really happens when the stakes are high. No one tells you that the opposing side, their lawyers, will happily use dirty tactics, and that they will deliberately try to block evidence, that they will exploit the system, bend the truth, and manipulate procedure to stop you from telling your story, especially if the truth might clear your name. And that brings me to something that stuck with me. I've watched a lot of crime documentaries, and I'm a bit of a fan, I admit, and I remember one in particular about Phil Spector. You might recall him. He was a legendary music producer in Hollywood, but an absolutely monstrous man. There was a story about how he brought a woman home, a B-grade actress, really attractive, who was working in a restaurant. He lured her back to his mansion, and by the early hours of the morning, or in the early hours of the morning, a gunshot rang out, and she was found slumped in a chair, dead, with a bullet wound to the head. And it was staged to look like a suicide. As the story came out, it turned out that Spector had a sick pattern. He'd bring women home, and if they refused him his advances, he'd isolate them and leave them alone all night in fear. He was later charged for this woman's murder, but what really stood out for me in the documentary, and this hit home, was the way that the LA Police Department struggled to prosecute celebrities. Not because they weren't guilty, but because they had money. Enough money to buy top-tier criminal lawyers, enough to buy expert witnesses who'd testify to exactly what they wanted. So in that Phil Spector documentary, they talk about how hard it was to make anything stick to celebrities in Hollywood. And he actually got a mistrial the first time, and it was only the second trial that they finally managed to convict him of murder. And the thing that really hit me in the documentary was the way they said it outright. Money is the most powerful thing when it comes to law. They gave a couple of examples that really stood out to me was, first of all, Michael Jackson, who, let's be honest, was as guilty as sin, but he essentially bought his way out of jail. And of course, there's the famous O.J. Simpson trial, where he was able to hire Johnny Cochran and a whole superstar legal team, and he was acquitted of murdering his wife. And when I heard those stories, I couldn't help seeing the parallel with my own experience, but in reverse. Because for me, due to a kind of terrible convergence of circumstances, I found myself completely without insurance cover. I had no money to defend myself. I had to rely on the goodwill of friends. And I say friends very much in air quotes, who were in the legal profession. And honestly, I was woefully disappointed by them. Looking back now, I realize with bitter hindsight that I should have, and actually could have, run my own defense, because the three legal representatives who supposedly acted for me, they were incompetent beyond belief. That experience taught me a brutal truth. Yes, the law is fascinating. It's interesting. But at the end of the day, if you have a lot of money, you probably have about an 80 to 90% chance of getting off, unless the evidence against you is absolutely overwhelming. And even in those situations, I'd say, if I had to guess, more than half the time, wealthy criminals get off anyway. They get off on technicalities. Some little error by the police or the prosecution is enough to sink the entire case, and the criminals walk free. Meanwhile, if you're innocent, but you don't have money, you have almost zero chance of being acquitted. And this has been a very sobering realization for me, because by nature, I've always seen myself as an optimist. I always wanted to believe that people act in good faith, that if you're innocent and the facts are laid out plainly, then the truth will prevail, that the liar or criminal will be exposed and punished, that the innocent person will be acquitted. But this just isn't true. I know that probably sounds cynical, but if you're watching this and you've stumbled across my channel, I really hope you hear me when I say this. The world is fundamentally unfair. The story that we're told in movies and TV, where the good guys and the bad guys are clear and the bad guys always get what's coming to them, that's not real. Honestly, it's a kind of disservice, because in real life, the bad guys probably get away with it most of the time. Sure, sometimes justice is done, and it feels great when you watch it and it happens in a movie or in the rare real life case. But those cases are few and far between. If you've ever been the target of real injustice, if you felt that fundamental unfairness of the world firsthand, know that you're not alone. Many, many people have been through exactly that. They have suffered because of those same unfair practices. And I think that's why I've always felt such a deep connection to the stories of people who were wrongfully convicted. People who spent years and even decades in prison only to be finally exonerated. What always strikes me in those stories is when I watch those wrongful conviction documentaries is this. You see these people being arrested and the media jumps all over them. The public is fed this image of a monster, someone who on the surface looks obviously guilty because all the evidence seems to point that way. And there's almost this gleeful reaction, this feeling of schadenfreude. People enjoy seeing them found guilty. The public celebrating that justice was served, only for the truth to come out years later. Some new piece of evidence emerges, or they uncover some gross procedural unfairness, and then suddenly these people walk free. And what really surprises me and humbles me is how often you see them coming out of prison after decades, wrongfully convicted, and they don't even seem bitter. It really makes you think. Honestly, maybe I have become a bit cynical because of my own experience over the last 10 years, but I'm in the process of telling my story. I've already written my first 2 books, and if you are interested, there are links in the description where you can start reading them and get acquainted with what really happened. I'm also on the way to publishing the next books in the series, because I wanted to lay out my version of events, the truth that was never properly presented in court. Because let's be real, it wasn't just a flawed process, it was rigged. It was rigged against me from the start. And just like those other examples I mentioned, the bad actors in my story threw serious money at the prosecution to frustrate my defense, to make sure that I was found guilty. I was vilified in the media, and even now, years later, there are still people who cynically believe that I must have done something wrong. And honestly, that's probably why I see this as my purpose in life, to tell my story, to give hope to other people who've been wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted. Even if you're out of options, no appeal left, no formal chance of justice, I hope you'll be inspired to tell your story anyway, because at the end of the day, no matter how many lies have been told about you, no matter how gross the injustice, I believe the truth will always come out. And I know if I survive long enough, and if no one takes me out, which quite frankly could happen, I will see the day when my truth is finally exposed. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you at all, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel, and I'll be sharing more of my story in the weeks and months ahead. It's a good story, and I hope it will inspire someone out there not to give up, not to become despondent, and to keep fighting to expose the truth.